Hello, we are still looking for a couple members of our panel. Mr. Stallworth, Ms. Lewis-Patrick, Ms. Monica. If you guys wouldn't mind joining us, we'd love to have you. Or we can just go it alone. So. Welcome. Thank you, everybody, for staying for this Q&A. Just give us a couple more minutes to get situated, and we'll get started. I've got, I think we're also looking for James McGovern.
He's on his way up.
Okay.
He didn't get the memo.
I'm Nancy Caffrey. I'm a columnist with the Detroit Free Press, and I'm currently joined by Kevin Orr, former, if you all just have seen the movie, so you know, former emergency manager of Detroit.
Hello, Nancy.
Hello. Sam Katz, the filmmaker, and a few other familiar faces we're waiting to have join us.
I hope you were happy with
How are you?
Good. You were great.
Oh, welcome Monica Lewis-Patrick of We the People of Detroit, and James McGovern, filmmaker, and former State Representative Tommy Stallworth. Oh, So now we have a full house now, so we're going to get started here. All right, so Sam, I'm going to start with the question that you left off with in your introduction. Why would a Philly guy make a movie about Detroit?
Maybe mental health problems. I spent my career in municipal finance, and there was in every official statement issued by a municipality in connection with its bonds a paragraph at the very end, Amanda Van Duzen will know this, that said bankruptcy. And in the 27 years that I was involved, I never read that paragraph because I never thought it was very important. And I'd never seen a bankruptcy. And when I was serving on the Board of Oversight for Philadelphia's finances, and Detroit started to go into bankruptcy and then finally went and appointed Kevin, and I thought, this is going to be a great story. And I just followed it for as long as I could, and finally in 2015, it was time to try to make it. And I realized that as a matter of history, all of the principal players weren't going to be available 20 or 30 years from now. And this, even though history needs usually more than 4 or 5 years to matriculate, I thought we had to do this right away, and I felt pretty good about it. It didn't occur to me it would take 6 years, but it was a great experience, and I really enjoyed it.
It was a little nerve-wracking to have been interviewed so many years ago. I was pleased to see that I meant everything I said. So,
You were great.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. You made me look great. So, for both of you... Huh?
It was messed up. You didn't mention the clawback about the extra depth of the pensioners.
15.5%, that's the biggest part. How you not mention that?
Well, we missed a lot of things. Let's just be honest. Well, let me tell you something. The good news is that there are many more opportunities for filmmakers to get it right if we didn't, but I think this film captured a balanced perspective, and I know...
15%.
Well, that's just one point of view, Cecily, and we all know. All right.
Well, so I was going to, that kind of bleeds into a question I was going to ask, which is, this is such a complicated story. How did you decide, you know, which threads to pull in telling the story?
Say that, which what?
I said, the bankruptcy is such a complicated story. There are so many threads to it. How did you decide how to tell this story for both of you, if you would like to, address?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it was actually, first of all, following the timeline, because I think we needed the viewers to understand what it meant to actually get to bankruptcy, and what a filing actually meant, and how the emergency management law came about. So that was a big part of it, was really getting into the timeline.
Robbing black people.
Well, you know, we talk about that a little bit, don't we?
Very low.
I think that the key thing from my point of view was that this was a extraordinarily complicated and
Grand theft.
difficult issue that people lived through in the city of Detroit, no matter which side you were on, and expressed themselves. And I felt that we made a decent effort, obviously not a perfect one, to represent all those points of view that were out there. The outcome was the only outcome that could have occurred. If you think what would have happened to the city of Detroit if it didn't own an art museum, there would have been nothing left. As Jerry Rosen said, it would have been dust. So the outcome here, I wouldn't argue that the art was valued necessarily properly, but it was valued based on what was the ability to raise. And I think the main thing that people should take away from a municipal bankruptcy is that there are political aspects to it that don't exist necessarily in a Chapter 7 or a Chapter 11.
You said 18 billion, but you end up with a whole lot less than that. So what was the 18?
Well, my understanding was that that 18 billion was going to be spread across the entire creditor class.
No, actually, let me
Yeah,
provide
thanks,
some data
Kevin.
points if I can, Nancy.
Go right ahead.
If I can. The total debt in for the city of Detroit was $18.5 billion, of which we resolved about $10 billion of that, basically on the backs of the creditor class, not secured creditors, the unsecured creditors. But let me give you a data point about that. Well, if I may, please. Let me give you a data point about that $18 billion. Between 2005 and 2008, the city borrowed $1.5 billion in high credit between the cops, and the reason they called them cops was because they were above the borrowing limit. It was illegal, so they used a nomenclature called cops. But it was basically, we're borrowing above the legal level we're able to borrow. Then they entered into the swaps, which is basically, as Ken said during the movie, a swap contract, which is insurance. If you take one side, I take the other side, and if you lose, you owe me $350 million in a termination. That's $1.5 billion. Let me give you a data point on that. If you'd taken that money in 2008, when the stock market was trading at 7,800, it's now trading at 37,000. That's a 5 times multiple. If the people who were in charge had the fiscal discipline to invest that money in a Dow Jones Industrial Index stock, they don't have to be a stock picker, they don't have to take any risks, just the standard Dow Jones Industrial, which is only 30 industrial stocks, okay? They would have had the equivalent of $7.5 billion. Not only would they have fully funded, and remember, this is principally the civil retirement pension fund, not the police and fire, which did not get a haircut because their management of their assets and funding was better than the civil. Not only would you have solved the pension crisis, you could have declared a dividend, but it didn't happen. They took the money, they gave it to the pension fund. Let's say they invested in a casino, they bought a private jet. There was a story on the street that an elected official told me that people walk down the street and say, hey, I'm going to the pension fund to get a loan. They say, what for? I don't know, but I'm going to get the money. We squandered that $1.5 billion, which would have been $7.5 billion today. And consequently, the city did not have the ability to pay that money into pensions. Let me give you another data point. According to the agreement with the city guaranteed the pension funds a 9% rate of return on investment, RR, okay, 9%. The average rate of return, the lowest one is in District of Columbia, 6.5%. We went down to 6.75. The average rate for municipalities is 8, so we guaranteed 9. That means that when the financial crisis hit in 2008 and 2009, when there was a 26% drop in the rate of return, that was a 35% deficit incurred in 2 years. Okay, 2 years. Yeah, no. What I'm saying is that was the guarantee. Make it 7.5. Okay, there's a $30 million deficit. That's a deficit the city can't pay.
Why didn't you
Okay.
do the illegal swap deal?
We did, and in fact, as you saw on the film, the worst participants, the civil side lost 4.5%. The financial creditors got 10 cents on the dollar. Okay, people say this is a moral obligation. Neither borrower nor lender be. Okay, you have an obligation to pay your deals, and we didn't do that. I have to tell you. The financial creditors are the ones that feel that they were the ones that were shafted because their estimate was that the art was $8.5 billion. Okay, we got 869 some odd million for it and saved it for the city. So to the extent people feel that this was theft and wrong, I came to the city as is. City as is was that people were dissipating $1.5 million and entering into illegal cops deals. Okay? That's the situation we found.
But Mr. Orr, I think one of the pieces that gets left out of this equation is you came into the city in an illegal and unconstitutional process.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that.
So as we talk about emergency management,
Let's talk about
what
that.
Detroiters cannot forgive is how you came into the city and the fact that you were unelected, unappointed, and many of the decisions that you made, we're still living with the legacy of those fallouts in terms of executive orders that still are in place today.
Yes, they are. And I appreciate that. But let's talk about that. Let's talk about the legal rubric. Your Constitution, State Constitution 1, makes the governor the chief executive of all subsidiaries and municipalities and subunits of the state. Okay? That's your Constitution. That's your, I know that. That's a truism. Are you adding something? I know that. So the Constitution makes the governor the head of the state. 2, your legislature passed the bills. In a receivership, which is under Public Act 436, there are certain rights, which, by the way, if you ever read 436, there are probably 36 different rights and obligations that the emergency manager has, of which I use none of them. None of them. Go and read none of them, okay? We came into the city, and each of the settlements that we reached in the plan of adjustment are negotiated settlements. Now, you're right, I was an elected official. But the process that came in was your Constitution, and once federal law vested, it's the same feeling in the supremacy clause of the United States Constitution that we heard in Chrysler when shareholders were upset because their interests went away, that we heard in Laidlaw, that you hear in any receivership is people are angry. And I hear your anger. But
we're not just angry, Mr. Orr. You actually destroyed lives. When you look out across this audience and even those that were projected into the film, these are pensioners. I'm not a pensioner of the city of Detroit, but fought valiantly for the pensioners of the city of Detroit. When you look at police and fire, they were protected. They were protected. 50% of police and fire don't even live in the city of Detroit. So when you don't have them contributing fully into the tax base, those things were a drain on the city. When there was not a fair and equitable negotiation of the water department that transitioned an actual critical asset, not only in Detroit, but in North America, when we actually should have been recouping about $215 million annually, and we are contributing to a $50 million lease agreement where Detroiters are paying about $13 million of that agreement. Yes. When there was no one that advocated for an equitable and just exchange in the 83-17 split, where Detroiters are still on the hook for processing the wastewater for 78 municipalities and townships, we are still subsidizing an entire region that we helped build. We not only put the world on wheels, we still are the arsenal of democracy as it relates to union rights, contracts, and the voting process that should have been respected in this city. Well, you've talked a lot, Mr. Orr. I'm at least trying to respond on behalf of community that is still reeling from the bad decisions that you were authorized to make by what we consider a racist leadership under Governor Snyder.
You have your dialectic, but you're giving them inaccurate information. Your water department, let's talk about DWSD now, Great Lakes Water Authority. Your water department's customer base were 60% outside the city of Detroit. It was your counties. 60% of the residents of Detroit did not pay their water bills. The county, which had paid in post time, distance, and elevation, a subsequent fees to move water out from the city to them and back, felt that they were very much taken advantage of. And their view was, we're not only going to leave Detroit, okay, we're not going to leave Detroit, we're going to create another water authority because Detroit has been exploiting us for the better part of 20 years. The Great Lakes Water Authority gave those counties governance voice, but you own the system. The city of Detroit owns it. And the Great Lakes Water Authority that was subsidizing a non-payment by Detroit citizens now has put that obligation onto the city of Detroit's governance. But there's another important factor. The payment common to all in the Great Lakes Water Authority also allows for money to go into the thaw fund, for no money for water. That fund, at the beginning of that negotiation, had $184 in it. to help people subsidize their non-payments. That fund now has over $5 million that came in.
But Mr. Orr, it takes $1 million to help 1,000 families in the city of Detroit. The other thing that we know about water is that the markups, Detroit is forced by the state of Michigan to sell its water wholesale. The markups are happening at the municipal levels, where each municipality is marking up water anywhere from 100 to 1,000%, and because of this deep racist divide in the state of Michigan that you help perpetuate. Because part of the reason you were brought in, you were a black man that they could get to do the bidding to be able to take over major assets and spin them off and sell them off against the interest of the city. And so I have to talk about what we know is true. Right now in the city, the major asset that you were a part of, you continuously gave away major assets of the city. When we look at, there are school buildings in this city that the taxpayers of Detroit invested anywhere from 8 to 9 to 10 million in, and you gave it to billionaires and millionaires for $1. Those were things that were inequitable and unjust as it relates to the residents of Detroit. So those are the issues that I must raise.
You're wrong. First of all, let me finish. Let me respond. First of all, the school system wasn't under me.
I didn't say the school system was under you, but sir, you guys collaborated and participated in spinning off major assets of the city of Detroit for the benefit of billionaires and millionaires.
Number two
is that all of these things can be substantiated in terms of research and data that has come out from the University of Michigan just since December. You had Sarah Hughes from the University of Michigan actually tie a cord that connects the emergency management to many of the water issues and crises that are happening across the state of Michigan. Everything from the water shutoffs that have impacted over 181,000 families in Detroit, to the toxicity in Flint, to the current lead poisoning in Bend Harbor. We can connect that tissue because of the research that has been done by people that attended the very institution that you attended.
Okay, so I think we can start from a place where we're going to agree that Monica and some folks are going to say that this was not a legitimate process, and Kevin says he was here to do a job. And can we agree on that and move forward with some questions? Sure. Because I want to talk to you, Monica. I have a question for you. You work with some of Detroit's most vulnerable people, and I want to talk about how their lives have changed since the bankruptcy. What can you tell us about the communities that you work with?
Well, our communities are still reeling. They're devastated. When you look at the average pension in the city of Detroit was about $19,000 a year. When you look at the fact that many of our schools are still in shambles and major displacement has happened there. When you look at what has happened with major departments in this city that are a part of maintaining major reporting and quality of health oversight, those things are problematic for a major city. And so what we're finding is you look at just recent occurrences of flooding in this city. When you don't factor in those impacts, when there is no one advocating downtown, not just for the benefit of downtown and midtown, but making sure those that live in the community are benefiting from these infusions as well. We're deeply devastated by the fact that we're on the hook for debt. How is it that we own a water department where we cannot ensure that the residents that live in the city that are on the hook for that water department have access to it? When you look at water rates having gone up, excuse me, Mr. Orr, I'm still speaking, sir. When you look at the fact that water rates have gone up over 285% over the past 2 decades, that on its face is unaffordable. And 40% of the population in the city living in abject poverty. So those conditions are still playing out when all of the revenue is being captured in the Downtown Economic Development Corporation. That is not filtering out to communities, and we've got to make sure we're being intentional with that.
I would like to make sure everybody on the panel gets a chance to get a question, but I will come back to you, I promise, okay? Okay, so Tommy? Hi. How you doing? So I want to talk to you about, you were obviously an instrumental part of putting the grand bargain together, but you wear a lot of hats in this particular movie. You were in the legislature at that time. You worked on contentious negotiations in a legislature where outstate Michigan does not always want to help Detroit. Can you talk a little bit about that process of trying to get everyone lined up to pull in the same direction?
Sure. And first, let me just thank you guys for doing your best to document what happened. At least it creates an opportunity to have dialogue, whether we, see things differently or not, and certainly there are some disagreements. But I think you captured the point quite well. I mean, for decades, Detroit had been ignored, abused by the state legislature, and there was very much an us versus them attitude. That attitude persisted throughout the bankruptcy. I think John Walsh and I did our very best to try to bring people together. And there's any number of things that could have derailed the whole legislative process that brought the money to Detroit in an attempt to help resolve the bankruptcy. A lot of tension within the Detroit caucus, tension within the Michigan Legislative Black Caucus, some of which you're hearing right here in terms of ultimately, all of our concern was really first understanding and recognizing that we did have an emergency manager, which we did not agree to.
That's right.
And in principle, we had done everything we could to reverse that, only to be undermined by the governor and the legislative process.
That's right.
But despite that, we were where we were, and we had to do something to try to minimize, and I say that very, accurately. There was no Disneyland ending to this thing. We were trying to minimize damage and harm to our city and to the residents. A lot of dialogue, and I think in terms of where things kind of changed, I think Monica or one of you mentioned how many retirees actually live in Detroit. Up until a point when we talk about Detroit retirees, I think everybody in the legislature assumed all retirees lived in Detroit.
Right.
It wasn't until we ran the data and found that the vast majority of them lived in Republican districts.
That's right.
That there all of a sudden became more of an appetite to work together. Even with that, it was not easy because again, there's just so much passion around this particular issue.
And one of the other hats you wear is that you're a lifelong Detroiter with from a family with a strong history of service, someone who is respected in the community. Can you talk a little bit about how this felt as a Detroiter, as someone whose probably family and friends were sometimes angry with you for what was happening?
Yeah. Well, it comes with the turf. My mother served 25 years in the legislature. I'm very proud of her and her record. She was always viewed as a person that was a strong advocate for children and for the Black community. And she accomplished a lot of really significant things in the legislature as a Black woman and a Detroiter. My brother served also, and I had the opportunity to follow. I was raised with a value that for public service. I think I mentioned or captured in the film that my first opportunity to work in the state capitol was I was 19 years old. And I really dreamed of an opportunity to follow my mother in her footsteps and really be of service to my community. I did my best to do that. To this day, again, as is evident on this panel, there are folks who disagreed with my position and what I did and criticized me. And again, but that's part of politics. That's part of what leadership is all about. And you got to take the good with the bad. All I know is I operated with the best intentions and with the love in my heart for those who are going to be affected by this, by these decisions, and for my community, with the hopes and aspirations that we could do something that would be a catalyst for improvement in the quality of life in the city of Detroit.
So, James and Sam, sometimes in those interviews with the representatives from Syncora and Fidget, they come off like cartoon villains. Could you guys, have you guys got any feedback from them on the film? How do they feel about how they were portrayed? And what was it like to be in those interviews where they were just kind of so blatantly privileging the swaps and things like that over pensioners and the city?
Well, first of all, I don't think they come across that way. I think they were hired to represent interests, and everyone, the word self-interest is an interesting word, but everyone has self-interest, and the companies that insured the bonds, I think, made a dumb investment decision, which they were entitled to make. Their fees were very high, which they were entitled to get, and their losses were extraordinary, which they deserved. But their representatives were supposed to do the job, and I don't think any of them had any experience in a municipal bankruptcy. I think they were all out of traditional corporate bankruptcy backgrounds where assets get divided up and money gets sent to creditors. And this is not, Chapter 9 is not that. It's never going to be that. It wasn't that in Stockton, and it won't be that in the next case. You can't favor Wall Street, and I think the critical factor was security. If you didn't have a secured interest, you were up the creek without a paddle, and both Fidget and Syncora insuring the cops and engaging in the banks and the swaps, they had no case, and to a large extent, I think they were lucky to get anything. But the argument that I thought that Stephen Spencer made about the value of the art collection, and I know this is not a popular thing to say in this building, that it was worth a lot more than 484 to 8, whatever the numbers were in the. But the fact of the matter is that the only amount that was going to drive the deal was the total amount that could be generated from foundations. And there was no cap. There was a cap on what they were going to do. It wasn't unlimited. So I was lucky, I think. James and I felt lucky to get Stephen Spencer and Stephen Hackney and Tim Coleman to speak at all, because I don't think they spoke to Nathan Bomey all that much when he was writing his book or writing his articles. And even Nathan, I think, was amazed that we got creditors to speak.
What did you make of, at the time covering it and then again watching the movie, it struck me in all kinds of ways that the outrage, the popular outrage generated over the threat to the art that didn't always command a comparable outrage because of the fate of pensioners. Can you talk a little bit about why you feel people reacted in those different ways?
Well, I mean, I think if you put a price tag on someone's head, that and you try and look at that as a price tag on a piece of art, and you try to create a value between the two, then yeah, that creates a lot of controversy. I think people, you look at like different social classes that were coming in. A lot of the people that were protesting the art were people that were coming in from the suburbs. And they were really, it is a cultural institution. I do believe that Detroiters also love the DIA and visit there, but I do feel that what you saw happening was a group of folks that, for the most part, the majority were for the DIA. Not to say that they were not for, helping the pensioners, but they came down once the DIA came into play, and you had a lot of Detroiters. Majority of Detroiters that were for making sure that the pensioners were kept whole, and I think that's where you saw these two factions.
Okay, so we're going to have two more questions, and Kevin, I promised I'd come back to you. So I want to ask you, it's been 8 years. Looking back, is there anything you would do differently?
Looking back, I think I was very concerned at the beginning about the passion and perhaps civil unrest. There were people in the city, you saw someone in the film about burn this mother down and that sort of thing, and the Oreo cookies and that sort of immaturity. But my concern was, having dealt with other high-profile restructurings, there's a value proposition to be preserved, whether it's Chrysler, now Stellantis, or Laidlaw, or anything else. And the value proposition is a back-end issue. And if the city had devolved to that area, that sort of era, and remember, Ferguson and other places were going on, then that value proposition evaporates, because people will say, it's too conflicted, I don't want to make the investment, I don't want to do some of the buildings that are going downtown, I'll go to Southfield. Some of the diaspora that we've seen before in other eras would unfortunately impact the city. So I moved very cautiously early on, but given the time frames that would involved, I think I would have moved quicker, because I don't think the majority of the people in the city of Detroit were going to take that bait. there wasn't going to be that level of civil unrest. And I say this all the time, we've been very fortunate. In fact, there wasn't that issue. There was one issue in July 2013 with somebody thought it was a cute idea to shut down the dispatch system, but the Michigan State Police already had dispatch switched over on the 4th of July holiday, so we didn't skip that. The other thing I think I would have done is probably would have explained the complexity of the deals better. Because when you talk about $9 billion in debt as a gross figure, that sort of goes over most people's heads, and they don't realize when you talk about the financial creditors, some of their investors are also retirees and pensioners. Some of them, if they're getting 10 cents on the dollar, that's a 90% write-off. That's really quite extraordinary. If they're getting 25 cents on the dollar, that's a 75% write-off. That just does not happen in other contexts. I mean, it's really, and they're given a hope note in terms of their ability to do anything else with property development, assuming that the city goes forward. So would have moved quicker, would have explained it more, because it's pretty sophisticated and most people aren't that used to it most of the time. But at bottom, rationalized debt gave your majority customers, in terms of services and opportunity, raised city services to an adequate level, which was by any objective measure far below any other municipality, and stabilized the balance sheet for the city, which sometimes is missing in the discussion.
Thank you. And Monica, our last question. We had a city that had a lot of challenges already, and then we've had a challenging few years with the pandemic. What are you most worried about in the months and years ahead?
Well, in the next couple of weeks and months, I'm very concerned about the ending of a significant moratorium on water shutoffs. We still have to recognize that even though our system has been bifurcated from DWSD into this Great Lakes Water Authority, our infrastructure provides 40% of the drinking water to the region. We still are responsible for processing the wastewater for a significant number of townships and municipalities in the region. And the fact that it took a global pandemic to convince us at a state and a local level that it was important to put a halt on shutting off water until we can get our arms wrapped around this very critical issue is of deep concern to me. I'm also concerned about the legacy debt. Much of the debt that many of Detroiters at the residential level are experiencing, that debt is not going to be forgiven with this historic infusion of infrastructure dollars. So we must find a way to renegotiate the Great Lakes Water Authority agreement with Detroit in a way that's equitable and just. The burden of 83% of processing the wastewater for 78 municipalities and regions will lead the city back into another bankruptcy.
I want to thank you all for participating on the panel. I want to thank all of you who stuck around for this question and answer session and who came to the movie. Let's give all our panelists and the filmmakers a round of applause. Thanks, everybody.